Hi, everybody. My name is Shana, and I would like to welcome you to this second session of our special mini-series on accessible technology presented by the Ottawa Public Library's Tech Café. The Tech Café is a weekly and sometimes twice weekly series of presentations designed to increase your knowledge and interest in technology. This presentation is called Assistive Settings and Features on Your Device and will be given by Steve Crane on behalf of Ottawa Foyers Partage's ComputerWise program. Steve Crane has spent over 20 years as a support worker for people with disabilities and has a lifelong interest in technology and making. He is a strong believer in the power of technology to change people's lives for the better and is working to increase the presence of people with disabilities in maker culture. ComputerWise is a not-for-profit program that aims to support adults with disabilities in using computers, mobile devices, and other technology to increase their independence and participation in community employment and recreation activities. Before I turn this session over to Steve, I would like to let you know that your microphones have been turned off to ensure the best sound quality. You will not be able to unmute yourselves. If you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the chat window at the bottom of your screen. Thank you very much for attending this online program presented by the Ottawa Public Library, and I will now turn the session over to Steve Crane. Okay, Steve, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Shana, and thank you everyone for coming. Welcome. Thanks for taking the time, and I do want to thank the Ottawa Public Library for inviting me to speak to you today. Now, we did a workshop like this last week where we talked about the considerations and first steps for getting assistive technology. But there's an important question you want to ask before you even get to that point, which is, what about the assistive technology you already have? Whether we're talking about an Android device, a PC or a laptop running Windows, a Mac or an iPhone, there's been a lot of effort, a big push over the last several years involved in adding features to make these devices more accessible. So today we're going to take a look at these. We're going to start with the Android platform. So let's jump right in. Apparently some people can't see me. Oh, I think there we go. Did that fix the problem, folks? I'm going to assume it did and go on, and if it didn't, then we'll work it out as we go. So I'm going to start with Android, mainly because it's the platform I'm most familiar with myself. A lot of the settings that we talk about are going to be available on all three of these platforms. It's not so much that Android did them first or best in a lot of cases, it's just that's where I know the most about them, so that's where I'm coming. Android is an open source operating system. We talked a bit about that last week. Open source means that the person who made the operating system or whatever thing we're talking about made it so with the permission that other people can use it and modify it as they see fit. Usually this is done with the provision that you can't then turn around and sell the thing that they're giving away for free, but this isn't the case with Android. With Android, it's free for commercial use as well, and that's why you see a lot of different companies. You see Samsung, you see LG, you see Google, all making devices, modifying the Android source code, installing it on them, and selling them. The difference here, of course, with Apple is that everything you buy with the Apple operating system on it is made by Apple. It's a very closed system. So the Android approach from an accessibility standpoint has, like most things, it has its ups and it has its downs. It can be more frustrating sometimes finding these accessibility features on Android devices because different companies modify the source code, they put different wrappers around it. If you're Samsung, you want your phone to feel like a Samsung phone, not just an Android phone. So things won't always be in the same place. They won't always be called the same thing. Some of the controls will be a bit different. As you move from device to device, your experience will be a bit less consistent. On the plus side is you do have a lot of different devices to choose from. If you can shop for the one that meets your needs. If you're a Samsung person and then all of a sudden you need a new device and all the reviews on the current Samsung devices are very bad, there's nothing stopping you from going down the road and looking at other device providers. Whereas if the current version of an Apple device is a lemon and you're an Apple person, There's really nowhere else to go there. The main advantage accessibility-wise that Android has is the openness of its platform means that anyone can make and publish apps for it with relative ease. I could write an app tomorrow if I was better at writing apps, publish them on the Play Store, and then you could download them and install them on your Android device the day after tomorrow. The Apple system is much more closed. Developers have to submit their apps to the Apple Store and have them approved, and there's a lot more hoops to jump through there. So you can find, in some cases, a lot more apps available, many more apps available on the Android platform. And also, Android devices, for the most part, will cost a bit less, so that can be a consideration as well. But before we start talking about apps too much, let's take a look at settings in the Android operating system. In order to do that, we have to first find the settings page on our Android device. Like most things with electronics, there are a few ways to get there. The first is that you swipe down from the top of your screen on your Android. This opens what's called the quick settings tray, and that contains some of the settings that most people use most often. One of these will be an icon of a gear. You tap that, and that takes you to the full list of settings for the device. Now, like I said, Android can be a little bit different from device to device. There can be a few idiosyncrasies there. On my phone, when I swipe down, that tray only opens halfway, and the gear isn't there. I have to actually swipe down twice to get to it. So, you know, like Android, it may take that little bit of extra learning curve to find things when you're getting used to it. Alternatively, if you swipe up from the bottom of the screen, you open the app tray. So this is just a big list of every app installed on the device. Settings is one of them, so you can scroll through until you see that gear and tap it. Or there's a search bar at the top of the app tray where you can type settings and find it that way. And the third way to get to the settings on an Android device is through Google Assistant. You can use that to open your device's settings page as well. If your keyboard is open, there's going to be a microphone icon that you can tap. Or you can say Google's magic words, which I'm not going to say right now because I probably have 3 things on my desk that will answer me. But Google's magic words and then settings, and it'll take you right there. If you have 3 different Google devices on your desk, you can specify which one you're talking to. You can say settings on my phone or on my tablet or what have you. So once you get there, you're going to be looking at a list of categories, things about your account, things about your network connections, all that stuff. Sometimes, again, this will vary device to device. Sometimes it'll be drop-down menus. If you tap one, it'll just open up the settings for that category underneath. Sometimes it'll take you to a new page and then you press back and you go back and forth. Sometimes it'll just be a big long list with headers for each section. But the content is going to be the same for the most part, device to device. One of these categories is accessibility. That's always going to be there, and that's where we're going to be spending our time with Android today. For newer Android devices, all the settings that I speak about that aren't actual apps that you install from the Play Store are already there. They're part of the stock OS. But some of them are a little bit new. So if you have an older Android device, you're going to need to install them if you're going to use them. This means going to the Play Store, finding the Android Accessibility Suite, and installing it. Now, after I talk about all the settings, there are a couple of Android apps I'm going to mention that are also in the Play Store. So if you're in that boat, if you need to install the Android Accessibility Suite and aren't sure how, then just stay tuned and I will cover it when we get there. So as you look at the settings on your Android device under the Accessibility tab, you will often find them, you'll pretty much find them divided into 4 groups. They'll be visual, auditory, motor, and cognitive. This is pretty common across all platforms, but what I found is that often accessibility features that are designed or intended for one group will have benefits for others as well. So if as a user, it really pays off frequently to look at the other sections as well, not just the one that you have the most urgent need for, because you'll never know what might help. So I want to stand back and take a little bit of a wider view. For the other platforms we talk about, I'm mainly going to be dividing things into what's the same as Android and what's different. But for Android, I'm going to actually be talking about 2 categories, problems with input and problems with output, because that's going to cover everything. With electronic devices, any issue you have is pretty much going to be with how you receive information from the device, which is your output, or how you send commands to the device, which is your input. So that's the context that we'll be using today, at least for Android, and then everything else more or less breaks into samesies and differences. So to start with, we're going to look at some ways you can adjust the output of your Android device to meet your needs. Now, first off, we have a magnifier, so that's very straightforward. When it's activated, you can tap on a section of the screen, and your view will zoom in so you can make that, so that will be easier for you to see. If you want something that requires a little less active involvement from you, you can just actually change the size at which text and items are displayed on the screen by default. So obviously these can be very helpful if you have a visual impairment, but they can also be very useful if you have dexterity issues. They can simplify the layout of the screen. They can give you bigger targets to hit. So it's not strictly a visual impairment feature. Now, these two types of features are things that are going to come up again and again today. On one hand, you have things that you basically set and forget. Changing the size at which the text displays on your screen, you really only have to do that once on a device as long as you're happy with the results. So I'm calling those settings, or trying to make a point of calling those settings as opposed to features. You have other accommodations on your device that you have to activate every time you use them, like the magnifier. Because if that was on all the time, it would get in your way, it would stop you from being able to do things. So for those, we actually need to be able to deploy them and then stow them away when we need them as quickly and conveniently as possible. You'll notice on the slide that there's a small icon of a person next to some of these things. That would be next to the features. That's the Android accessibility guy. And we're going to learn more about him in a few minutes, but for now, you can just know that if he's next to something, it's something that you're going to have to activate in order to use. So screen readers, the ability for your device to read text on the screen to you. Of course, this can be useful if you have a visual impairment again. It can also be useful if you have literacy issues. Android actually comes with two completely different ones built into the operating system. The first is TalkBack. TalkBack is more of a setting. You turn it on and it's always there. Everything you tap on the screen will be described. Then they have Select to Speak. Select to Speak actually waits for you to activate it, and then you can select some text, you can draw a little rectangle, or you can just tap a section of your screen and it will read what's in there. What's pretty nifty about it is it can also be used to read text from images in your camera. So if you're at a restaurant, you can take a picture of the menu and then use your Android device to read that to you. So again, you have sort of two different levels of involvement there with your accessibility accommodations on Android, and you can pick which one's most comfortable for you. Now we've got a few that are specifically oriented towards people with hearing impairments. I can't see them being of much use to other folks for the most part. If you use a hearing aid, many hearing aids nowadays have a Bluetooth capability, so you can pair them with your Android device. So instead of your device playing noise through its speakers and then you're relying on your hearing aids to pick it up, it just sends the sound directly the same way it would to a pair of wireless headphones. If you don't have a hearing aid and have, say, a temporary medical condition that affects your hearing, or you've just been diagnosed and don't have a hearing aid yet, you can try and use your Android device as an impromptu hearing aid. The microphone on the device will pick up ambient noise and then send it an amplified record of that to your headphones. I can't say I know how well this works. I've never tested it. But if you find yourself in that boat, it's definitely something to keep in mind, worth testing. If you have experience with this, I'd really love to hear about it. Now, so far we've been talking about settings that help you use your device. But every once in a while you come across something that helps your device, where your device helps you in your environment. And that's what we're going to talk about next. This is called sound notifications. What sound notifications does is your device actually listens to the area around you and will alert you visually on the device or through vibration notifications, all the normal ways, to sounds it thinks you need to know about. like smoke alarms, like crying babies, barking dogs, things like that, things that you may need to know about. So this is a really, really interesting thing. I haven't tested this either. I'm going to go out on a limb and tell you right now, it's probably not 100% accurate, and it's probably not something that you want to bet your life on. Because this is basically an AI-driven feature. So this is a good point to actually break off for a minute and talk about AI. Because this one and actually the next few features I'm going to discuss all rely on it. What an AI-driven feature means is that instead of strictly following instructions from you, where there's very little room for error, your device is actually taking in information from its surroundings and then making decisions about it. So for sound notifications, for that to work, you're relying on your device correctly identifying sounds that happen around you. Now, the fact that this exists at all compared to where we were, say, 10 years ago is nothing short of amazing, but at this point, it's still far from perfect. So these next few features, you will have to take the results with a grain of salt because they sort of get better as they hear and identify more sounds over time. The algorithms become more and more accurate, but it takes a long time and we're 100% just flat out not there yet. Another example of this is Android live captioning. This is going to listen to audio using your device's microphone, so it can pick up phone calls, it can pick up a nearby radio or TV, a video playing on your computer. It will take what's being said and it will display caption boxes on your screen showing what has been said. So it's a speech to text engine, basically. So again, this can be very, very useful for people with hearing impairments. I know people who just simply have a lot of difficulty assimilating information when they receive it verbally, and they're much better when things are written down. So this can be very useful, but if you try it out, you will very quickly realize that the transcriptions aren't perfect. In my experience, they're generally close enough that you can know what the person actually said from context, but kind of the same way if anyone who's used autocorrect on their phone, there'll be that same sort of thing, those same sort of miscues. And sort of an emerging theme in Android is you have another version of a very similar tool right next to that one, live transcribe. The main difference between live captioning and live transcribing is that captioning shows you the captions and then they go away and they're gone forever. So it's great for phone conversations, just quick little snippets of things. But if you want a permanent record of what was said to refer to later, you're not going to get it there. That's what live transcribe is for. So live transcribe can be great when you need that same functionality for classes or doctor's appointments or meetings where you're going to need this information later. It also makes this feature much more useful for people with memory issues. It saves that conversation to a written file that you can review it later. The real caveat here is that effectively you're recording a conversation with someone. So of course there are consent issues there. It's never polite to record someone when they aren't aware of it. So that is pretty much our output settings. We're going to move on to a few apps before we get into the input settings. And now, instead of being found in the settings menu, these are made by third-party developers. They're published in the Play Store. In order to get to the Play Store, your device will almost always have a shortcut to it on your main screen. The icon is basically just a triangle in Google's colors. If it's not on your screen, you won't find it in the quick settings tray, swiping down from the top of your screen, but swiping up for your app tray. You can find it the exact same way you find it by settings, and you can also launch it through Google Assistant. When you open the Play Store, like I said, there's a lot in here, so it can be beneficial for you to just kind of search around, search for things like accessibility, search for, if you have trouble with Android's keyboard, search for keyboards. You'll find a lot of interesting stuff. But if you know exactly what you're looking for example, if you're looking for the Android Accessibility Suite, there's a search bar at the top. You can type that in, or you can use your voice to enter the data there. It'll take you to the page for that app, or at least a list of search results where you can find it. And then you'll be able to tap the install button to install it. So yes, that is how you get the Android Accessibility Suite if you happen not to have it already. Now, what we are going to talk about now are a pair of apps that can be very helpful for people with visual impairments. The first one is called Lookout. It's another AI thing, so be wary. Be careful when you're searching for it because there's also a much larger, an app with a much larger presence called Lookout. That's just like a security thing. So it can be easy to confuse the two. I think they're even similar colors. So you may want to search for Lookout Accessibility or Lookout Visual Impairment or Lookout AI or any other quality of the app to help you narrow in on it. So what Lookout does is it uses your device's camera and an AI algorithm to read text to you in much the same way that Select to Speak does, and also to describe objects around you. So I could open up Lookout on my phone, I can point my phone at my laptop, and it will say laptop. That's the idea. So again, not 100% accurate. In walking around our office testing it, it mistook a stack of boxes for a building. So you're going to have, you can't bet your life on the results, but it can be helpful. Wow, I'm really being hard on AI in this workshop. I didn't really plan this. But then if you want to get around those sort of pitfalls, there's a similar app called Be My Eyes. It addresses similar problems, but it gets around the failings of artificial intelligence by using actual intelligence. The app's developer has employees, or there are also volunteers who use the app to help people. And what this will do is when you ask for help, it will place a video call, and then a volunteer or an employee will use your device's camera to look at what you're seeing and then give you information about it and answer questions. So it can help you read faded labels. It can help you find directions if you're lost. So it's definitely, I very much like the fact that there's a volunteer aspect to it. It's one of those sort of good story kind of technology apps. So obviously this is generally going to be a lot more accurate than Lookout, but the downside of it is that you're using it in conjunction with somebody else. So if the question you have has privacy concerns attached to it, you may be reluctant to use this because some stranger is going to look through your camera at whatever it is you're wondering about. So now we're going to talk a bit more about the difference between settings and features, as I was speaking about earlier. The biggest issue with features is that you need a quick, convenient way to activate them when you need them and get them out of the way when you don't. Android has two ways of doing this. This would be on the next slide. In my opinion, oh, that's input settings. All right, well, you know what? I'm going to jump around then because apparently things are in the order of things got messed up somewhere. Oh, wait, there we are. All right, fair enough. Thanks a lot. Yeah, so Android has two ways of activating your features as opposed to your settings when you need them. In my opinion, one of them is absolutely terrible and shouldn't be used. To pick between them, you go to your settings page, you select accessibility, and then you scroll down until you see system navigation. You got two options here. One is 3-button navigation, the other is gesture. What gesture means is that in order to access the features, you'll need to perform some action on your device. It might be holding down both volume buttons or swiping up from the bottom of your screen with 2 fingers instead of 1, something like that. In testing this, I have not found that these shortcuts work very well at all. I'm going to be 100% honest here. Now, that may just be something specific to my phone, or it might be something specific to my fingers. So if that method appeals to you, go ahead and try it. But I had no luck with it at all. The other method is called 3-button navigation. This puts a small bar at the bottom of your device. And it's got initially 3 buttons on it. It's got a back button, a home button, and then a button that just calls up all of the apps you currently have open so you can switch between them. When you activate the shortcut for one of your accessibility features, it puts a 4th button up there, and we may recognize him. He's the Android accessibility guy, so that you can activate that feature just by tapping him. He's always on the screen. He's always in the exact same place. So it's very easy to get to those features there as opposed to trying to do these motions that I found didn't really work very well. If you end up using more than one of these accessibility features, then you actually can hold down the Android accessibility guy on your device, and it will pop up a window where you can pick which one you're looking for at that moment. So I gotta say, I tried them both and I found 3-button gesture to be far more reliable, far more consistent, far easier to use. So when you're using features, those are your choices for how to get to them. So now let's take a look at the input, how you send commands to your device. There we are. Android will show you the apps. Android will show you your apps in that app tray, that list. It's actually more of a grid than a list because it's got columns and rows. You can change the size of that grid. You can change the number of columns in it. You can change the number of rows it displays at a time. You have an Android accessibility menu. So this takes some of those hard to use hardware controls on the phone, if you do have issues with those, apparently like me, and it puts them in an on-screen menu. So you got a nice large button you can press to do it. So it has things like adjusting the volume, powering the phone on and off, some things like this. Now, of course, some apps on your Android device are going to require you to either tap or to hold on a location on your screen. So you can change the duration there. You can change how long the device waits before deciding whether something is a tap or a hold. You actually don't have to use your touch screen at all on an Android device. If you prefer a mouse, you can pair a mouse to it via Bluetooth and you're off to the races. Android also supports switch access. Now, this is something folks may not be as familiar with. Basically, this means connecting an external button to your Android device. And when it's activated, there are a few different ways it's implemented across different platforms, but basically the idea is if I press the button, it'll start tracking a line down from the top of my screen. When I press a button again, it'll start tracking across. And then when I press the third time, it'll send my tap or my click or whatever command to that location, the crosshairs basically. So someone who may only be able to move one finger or have one way of registering input can still get pinpoint accuracy on this device. And then the other hands-free option, of course, voice control. We actually saw that a little bit already with opening our settings page using Google Assistant. You can send different commands. You can make phone calls, send text messages, open apps, navigate your menus. And Google Assistant also has a lot of spin-off environmental effects. You can, of course, it can be tied to home automation hardware, so you can control other things in your house, like your lights or your window blinds. You can use it to set reminders for appointments or med times or other things you need in your life. So there's a lot of flexibility and a lot of options there. Now, of course, the big issue with Google Assistant is its verbal commands. What if I don't speak very loudly or clearly? There's actually an add-on app for that called Action Blocks. It's available in the Play Store. This allows you to set up shortcuts where you enter a series of commands on your device once. It puts that shortcut in a button on your screen where you can actually circle back to just tactilely using your device, where if you press that button, it will do those things. So really, we're just scratching the surface here. I'm kind of getting wary of time because I still have 2 operating systems to cover here. But there's a lot more available in the Play Store. You can get different, if you don't like the Android keyboard, there are different ones. There are different on-screen menus. So there's a whole lot there. It's well worth exploring, but we should probably be jumping on to iOS at the moment. So iOS, Apple devices, so your iPads, your iPhones, so on and so forth. This should actually go a bit more quickly because a lot of these features we've already covered and it's just pointing out where they are, but we're going to jump right into it. So as we said earlier, Apple is a more closed system. This makes your experience more consistent device to device, but the cost there is some lack of flexibility because Apple really wants their devices to feel like Apple devices. So those smooth animations and transitions, they really, really like those. They really like the way things are laid out. And that's one of their big selling points. So sometimes it's hard to get away from that if you're finding it's making it harder for you to use the device or you want to use it differently. And of course, Apple products can also be a bit more expensive. That's something to take into account as well. Let us see. So yes, finding the settings on your Apple device. Pretty similar. Out of the box, they're pretty much always going to have their own gear icon. It's not the same one as Android, but it's a gear on the home screen where you can tap it and get to your settings. That's pretty much going to be there unless you remove it. But you can then, on iOS, if you swipe down from anywhere in the screen, that brings up a search box. So from there, you can type settings and find that no matter where it is. And you can also use Apple's voice assistant Siri. So if you've activated this already, the thing with the voice assistants is they have to be configured beforehand. They have to be turned on so that they know to listen to what you're saying and listen for commands. So if you've activated Siri, you can use it to launch settings. You just say, ask it to launch settings. You can activate it either through Apple's magic words, which I won't say in case any of you guys have devices around that'll pick up my voice and answer, or by holding down the home button on your Apple device, which on a lot of Apple devices is kind of the only button on the front. The settings page in iOS on the iPad that I tested it on is laid out a bit differently. It's got two panels. All of your settings are listed down the left side. And then when you pick a category, all of the settings in that category are listed in the right side panel. On an iPhone, because of the smaller screen size, it may be different. It may look a bit more like Android. I don't have an iPhone, so I didn't really test it on both, to be brutally honest with myself. But it's still pretty easy to find everything. And you can actually scroll back and forth through different categories very easily. So Apple settings that are the same or similar to Android settings. VoiceOver is Android screen reader. It's more similar to TalkBack, where it will constantly describe everything that's tapped, everything that's touched. So the mechanics there are you tap it once and it'll describe it. You tap it twice and it'll activate it. Zoom magnifies the screen. The main difference here is that the gestures involved are a little bit more complicated from looking at the instructions on it. You'll find that a lot on iOS things where they'll say, swipe down with 3 fingers or tap with 2 or things like that. In the past, definitely, and still to an extent today, Apple uses more expensive touchscreens. It's a different kind. So you can use those gestures more efficiently, whereas an Android may not actually notice the difference between them because the touchscreens involved are often cheaper. So that's why you see that a lot. And I actually don't know if that gap has been narrowed much at all today. I can only say it definitely was the case in the past. But moving on. The magnifier setting lets you use your iPad or iPhone as a magnifying glass. Now, this isn't listed as an accessibility setting in Android, but if you have an Android device, it has a camera. You can open the camera, you can zoom on things. You effectively get the same functionality. The only caveat being that different Android devices are going to have different cameras. If you have a device with a crappy camera, you're not going to get good results. Changing the size of text and icons as they are displayed on the screen, of course. And Apple's spoken contents feature, it behaves more like select to speak from earlier. So it'll audio describe things when you actually select them instead of all the time. Switch access, Apple has that as well. So same thing, you plug an external switch in and then the software will help you use that to click. Yes, sorry. And you can connect your Android device, your Apple device to hearing aids as well. Apparently Apple actually makes their own hearing aids, which is interesting. So if you're a real Apple booster and you have a hearing impairment, you may actually get better results going with hearing aids that are made by the same company that makes your device. A lot of times there's better compatibility there. And then of course, voice control. You can use Siri to control your iPad or your iPhone with your voice. So differences, there are a few. The assistive touch feature is similar to Android's accessibility menu, but it's actually much more in-depth. There's an app on the Android store called Assistive Touch. It may be the same thing. I didn't actually install it and test. But if it is, it's worth looking into because Apple's version of this is actually much better. You can customize much more, whereas Android, there's just a checklist of, I want the accessibility menu to have the following things. With Apple, you can kind of pick what's in there and it's much better. Yeah, so again, that again comes down to Apple expects people to use the touchscreen for more different things. So of course, when you can't, they need more support to get you there. Apple also has several touch accommodations that I really wish Android devices had. The big one is you can set how long you need to touch the screen in order to register an input at all. So we talked about the hold duration on Android. With Apple, I can set it so that if I don't touch the screen for, let's say, half a second or 2/3 of a second, it doesn't actually think I touched it at all. So that can be great for people who have tremors in their hands or minor motor difficulties, or they have trouble with getting that nice register of touch to use the touchscreen. Apple can be configured to use, wow, sorry, that wasn't even a sentence. Your iOS device can be controlled by your Apple TV remote if you're an Apple TV person. So that actually gives you tactile buttons that you can use to control your device externally. So that's really, really good. No connection needed, of course, because it's a remote control. Guided access is something I haven't seen the equivalent on Android. Turning this on will basically say, ignore any contact with the screen that isn't in this area. So if you end up accidentally switching away from what you're doing all the time, let's say a web page that has a lot of pop-ups and you have some motor difficulties, you can actually cut those out of the touchable area of the screen using this so that you can stay on what you're working on. On the downside, I did not find a good analog for live transcribe and live captioning for iOS, at least not in the operating system. There are probably apps on the Apple Store that have these, but native in the OS, I didn't find anything that did that same work, at least nothing I was satisfied with. So you may have to look around a bit for that feature if you're an Apple user. And that brings us to Windows. Again, you'll find some familiar things here, but there's also more new stuff, particularly when it comes to input. Windows computers were initially designed for a keyboard and mouse, whereas Android and Apple and iPads and iPhones were more or less designed as touchscreen devices. So that keyboard and mouse interaction requires a lot of accommodation when it doesn't fit people's needs. Also, Windows is a much more complicated operating system because it's been around so long and is expected to do so many things. It's more complicated. It's also very flexible. Android and iOS both do a very good job of lumping their accessibility settings in their accessibility sections. Windows, because there's so much, not as good. When you want to find your settings on Windows, you look for the lower left corner of your screen. You'll see the Windows logo. That's a button. You can click that. It'll bring up a start menu, and that gear icon is in there. Again, it's a different gear, but they're all gears. And that'll bring you to your settings menu. You can also just type the setting that you're looking for in that search bar beside it and cut out the middleman, which Windows, their sort of organizational structure for this is really weird right now because they kind of completely revamped it. So it can be very hard to find what you're looking for navigating those. So I recommend using the search bar whenever possible. It'll simplify your life a fair bit. But Windows, you'll find more settings that can help you that aren't in their accessibility sort of menu, which is called the Ease of Access Center. All right, common things in Windows that you'll also see in the other platforms. It's more, like I said, it's more important than ever to check other places as well as the Ease of Access Center, but that's where we're going to start. You'll see a list of categories with the settings. The layout is similar to the Apple, where you have your categories here and then the settings for that category when you pick it in the right-hand panel. Windows has a magnifier. It has a narrator, which is basically an always-on screen reader, which we're pretty familiar with by now. You can customize some of what it reads, but for the most part, it's always on. If you need more control over what it reads and doesn't read, something like select to speak, you're probably going to have to go to a third-party application. Windows can actually display a visual alert for things that are normally audio cues. So things that your computer would normally beep to warn you about, it can flash the screen at you instead. And one more quick point about the layout of the settings page. is whenever you go to a category, there'll be the accessibility settings, and then underneath there'll be usually a link called related settings. So if you're in the ease of access / display, underneath that there'll be additional settings which will bring you to all of the display settings for the machine. So while there's a lot more, you can find it. It can be a bit more complicated, but what you got to do. All right, differences. These are Windows specific settings and features. So a lot of, like I said, come down to the use of the mouse and keyboard. Windows has made some real big strides in touchscreen devices lately, but still most Windows users are used to their keyboard at the very least, if not the mouse as well. And the other big difference is that you're going to tend to have bigger screens on Windows devices, PCs, and even laptops. So it can be very hard to keep all of those. A mobile device, you're generally looking at one app at a time. Windows, you can have a bunch overlapping each other, so it can be very, very difficult to manage from a dexterity issue, from a visibility issue, and from a cognitive issue point of view as well. You can adjust how long notifications stay on your screen when they pop up. So you can have more time to read them or more time to get to them and click them if you need to. One of the potential difficulties using a mouse is finding the mouse pointer. Windows used to be terrible for this. Now it's absolutely great. You have a great deal of control over the size and color of your mouse pointer, so you can pick something that's going to work from you. You can also have it send out a little pulse on the screen when you press the control key. Windows has a lot of accommodations for visibility, several color filters designed with different medical conditions in mind. And while the mobile platforms feature a light theme and a dark theme, Windows makes sure it has a high contrast theme, where it's not just overall things being light and dark, it's how light and dark things are relative to the things next to them. It can be a little bit jarring because, like, kind of by definition, these colors clash, but it can be very helpful. Windows has an on-screen keyboard. Of course, on Windows, it's more of an accessibility feature, whereas it's just the norm on mobile devices. Windows users will likely be familiar with keyboard shortcuts, where you have commands that you execute by pressing more than one key on your keyboard at a time. Windows has an accessibility feature that will let you press these keys one at a time. So for example, if copying something is holding Control and pressing C, I can turn this on so I can just press Control and press C, and it'll read that as if I did them at the same time. You can basically reduce the sensitivity of your keyboard using filter keys. This will let you, if you find yourself accidentally pressing keys more than once, either holding them down until they repeat or hitting them multiple times, you can adjust the keyboard so that those extra actions are filtered out. There are a lot of difficulties in using a mouse, particularly with things like dragging and double clicking and this sort of thing. There's kind of a high dexterity requirement there. You can actually, you got to get out of the ease of access center here, but you can actually turn all of those things off. You can change the speed at which you double click so that it's very slow and easy to do. Or you can say, I don't want to double click at all. I want to hover over something to select it and then click it once to open it. You can use click lock so that when you want to drag something, instead of holding your button down for the entire duration, you hold your button for a second. Then when you let it go and move your mouse, it's dragging. And then when you get to where you want to put it, just click to let it go. And of course, you don't have to use a mouse at all. Windows has an accessibility feature where you can use the numeric keypad on the right side of your keyboard to move your mouse and point, which most of us don't really use those keys for much anyway, so it can definitely be a good backup. I've actually used this as a backup when my mouse ran out of batteries and I didn't have a new one. But yeah, you get 4 directional movement. You can click, you can drag, you can right click, everything you normally do. Right, so I'm mindful of the time. I have one more feature that I wanted to discuss, but I figure we'll take some time for questions if people have them. And then if they don't, I can kind of circle back to that. So I see Kareem. If you have manual dexterity problems, is there an audio option? Was this in reference to a specific feature or just generally?
The question was related to an Android device, whether it's a tablet or even whether we can use it with a Windows PC.
Sorry, I have to apologize. I had trouble hearing you there. Can I get that one more time?
Oh, okay, so I was thinking of a tablet
Mhm.
or a PC. So if you have manual dexterity issues and you have trouble even moving a mouse, is there like a Google Assist or a Siri that's on, I know on a tablet, I guess you can use Google Assist. I know
Right.
on my Android phone, smartphone, I can use Bixby, I think. And that's the Samsung, but on a PC, is
Right.
there something where you can, I may have seen it, but then forgot about it. Can you actually talk and say, do this?
Gotcha. Yes. So Windows has their own virtual assistant called Cortana. So it does have voice command as part of it. I can't really attest to how well it works. It's not something I've had a lot of experience with, but it is there and it says it does that. So we'd have to try that and see basically, but you can use voice commands on Windows and open programs and things like this. You can also, so there's a whole nother level we didn't really touch on here with Windows, where you have all of these web apps that you can use. Whereas, let's say if you want to, now if you're talking about actually controlling the operating system, Cortana is going to be the way to go. But if you're talking about, let's say, dictating emails or documents on Windows, if you don't like the way Cortana does it, if you open up Google Docs in your web browser, then you've got all the Google tools for accomplishing that. The only limitation there is that they're only really usable in the in that browser. So there are some creative workarounds you can do there where you can have different virtual assistants and different engines working on different things. There are also some very specific, not operating system related, but there are tools like, I'll actually be talking about some of them next week, like WordQ and Dragon Speaking Naturally, that will give you some voice control and or dictation options, speech to text. So I guess the short answer is yes. Is there an option from C. Duke? Is there an option to get Windows 10 to live caption Zoom, WebEx, and other audio? There is not one in the Windows operating system that I'm aware of, or that I found in researching this. But that's another thing where there are web apps that can do it for you. Otter.ai is, here, I'm actually going to throw this in the chat. So that's a website. It does effectively the same thing as Live Transcribe from Android. You make an account, it will save your recordings on the site. You get a certain number of minutes free per month, and after that, there are paid plans if you end up using it a lot. But it's a similar issue. You basically have that open in a tab on your browser, you start recording, and that will work for, they're actually partnered with Zoom, where if your organization has a certain level of Zoom membership, it's sort of included. But if not, you can open it in a browser and run it. I actually find it very useful. It even does a pretty good job of distinguishing one voice from another. If two people are talking, if you have a meeting where there's 3 or 4 people involved, afterwards it'll go through and it'll try and separate people by voice print, and it does a decent job of it. So for live captioning, it does that, and it also gives you a record afterwards. What do I recommend, an Apple device or an Android? I'm an Android guy. I've never owned an Apple device. I find, so this is my personal opinion, it's not professional at all. I just find that what they sell is more aesthetics than anything else. But like I said, for some needs, like their touchscreen accessibility features are actually better than Android. So if that's your issue, or you're buying for somebody who has issues in that realm, then that's definitely a consideration. So basically, from an accessibility standpoint, it comes down to what somebody's going to use. But for me personally, I've never owned an Apple device and I never plan on. Are there any apps for outside navigation that do not require Wi-Fi or can use public Wi-Fi? Well, I think most apps probably, for navigation, I would have to assume that most apps require more of a data connection even than Wi-Fi, because they're basically using like GPS, like satellites and things. I gotta tell you, this isn't something, I don't want to really say too much here because this isn't something I've done any real research on. Like I'm not trying to put myself over here as like an expert on all things accessibility related. Everything I'm telling you is basically when someone has had an issue and I've been supporting them with it, I've done the research on that issue. So I'm gonna have to say I don't know on that. I can't answer confidently one way or the other. Devices that are hardened to dropping. You can get devices that are hardened to dropping. It's much easier to get cases that are hardened to dropping. You can get some real high-end rugged cases that can take a lot of dropping, and a lot of them will have extra features built in where there's a loop to grip on the back, or something you can put a lanyard on for somebody to prevent something from being dropped. A larger keyboard on a smartphone, definitely doable. Pretty much any Bluetooth keyboard, you should be able to pair it with a smartphone. The only reason the phones don't have big keyboards is because, of course, it's a phone, so everybody wants to lug a keyboard around. If you need one, it's definitely doable. The same as a mouse. So yeah, once you have one, I mean, you're going to settings, connections, Bluetooth probably. Bluetooth is, in most phones, going to be in your quick tray. And then whatever pairing instructions the device has. Generally speaking, for two things that are going to be very close to each other, Bluetooth is going to be a pretty solid connection, and it's going to be pretty easy to set up. Yeah, once you have the keyboard connected, whatever app you're opening where you're going to be typing in, so whether it's your Messages app or Facebook Messenger or WhatsApp or whatever you're using, then it should just work just like on a keyboard, just like on a PC. Just use your keyboard and type. And that connection also works the other way. Windows has recently partnered more closely with Android, where there are settings where you can kind of coordinate your devices and use your PC keyboard to type on your Android device when you're in the same place where they both are. Braille keyboards. That's another one where I'd have to actually do a little bit of research. I have seen devices like Braille sort of displays and input devices that can connect. I've never used one, so I don't really know. But another thing is, I believe Android has what they purport to be a Braille functionality using the touchscreen. Now, I'm not 100% sure how this works because to me, Braille is a series of like tactile bumps, and obviously your touchscreen can't do that. But that would be worth looking into. CNIB would definitely be a good resource there. Yeah, so we have had some participants in our program with visual impairments, but not very many to the point where they're using Braille. They are more usually things like larger displays, high contrast, and some visual aids has been more the kind of support that they've needed. Explain more about home automation. Sure. So basically, because these virtual assistants are kind of everywhere nowadays, and almost everyone has Wi-Fi nowadays, someone had the great idea of what if we make a light bulb that connects to the Wi-Fi network? So basically, you will have either special versions. So for example, if you have your light bulb will have a small Wi-Fi connector and control board built into it, so that when you put your light bulb in, your normal light switch, you'll just turn it on and leave it on, and that gives power to that controller, which connects to the Wi-Fi and listens for a command to turn it on and off. There are also ways around that using mechanical controllers. A lot of people do use like Raspberry Pis and little computers with mechanical switches that they attach to the wall to move a light switch up and down. Smart TVs are a big one, where they're all built with connections to smart TVs are built to connect to Wi-Fi anyway, so they are often integrated with one or more virtual assistants like Alexa or Siri or Google Assistant, so that you can send those commands and control them by speaking. Basically, the main thing you're going to need for home automation is something that's picking up a mic. So with some things you can use your device as that controller. You tell your phone to turn off your lights, and your phone turns off your lights. Other times you will have, that's where you see like the Google Home, the little mini dots or the big consoles, where there's basically a microphone or computer to capture and interpret the commands and send it to whatever connections you connected to. Bluetooth keyboard allows typing by touch as keys can be felt. So do you mean like just basically different keys have different textures? Like that's definitely a consideration, but yeah, definitely it's not equivalent to Braille. Enlarge the keyboard size on a smartphone, on an iPhone, without using an external device via Bluetooth. I don't know as much about on an iPhone. I have seen on Android keyboard apps where they will basically take up more of the display with the keyboard. You could also look into using the keyboard different ways instead of tapping the keys, the sort of swipe keyboards, where you just kind of draw from letter to letter. I would imagine that that is definitely something that's available on the iOS platform, if probably not in the operating system, at least I didn't see it, but at the very least, there's going to be apps that do that. I would be surprised if there wasn't, but I don't use Apple devices enough to really know off the top of my head. Reliable advice on wiring your house for automation. So I actually ran afoul of this myself. I bought a couple of LED light bulbs for my kitchen that had Wi-Fi capability. And one of the pitfalls of LED lights that I didn't know at the time is your wiring, if your wiring in your place isn't great, they flicker a lot. Like the other, like generally speaking, LED lights, as opposed to say fluorescent lights, which we used to have in our office, they have a very smooth, steady light as opposed to that pulsing flickering. But if the wiring isn't up to the task, it actually doesn't work very well. So I kind of took a header on that one. I would say if it's the wiring of your house, you definitely need an electrician if there's anything like that. As far as making sure your Wi-Fi network reaches everywhere in your house, there are definitely things you can buy, extenders and whatnot. Yes, I think this is going to be our last thing. I saw Shayna come on, so I think we're out of time. But visually impaired typists can memorize the keyboard and type. Yes, this is possible, but I mean, one of the things I believe about accessibility in general is that I don't want to enforce a solution on somebody just based on this is what can be done. If somebody prefers Braille, obviously I want to try and accommodate them with Braille first before we fall back to things like memorizing the keyboard layout and using a Bluetooth keyboard.
Okay, I'd like to thank Steve very much for this very interesting and informative presentation. I'm sure we all learned a lot. And I'd like to let you know that this session has been recorded and will appear on the library's YouTube page in a few weeks. I would also like to let you know that you will receive a follow-up email from Eventbrite with links to some important resources, including links to the PDF of Steve's presentation. Join us again next week for the last session in this mini-series on accessible technology, when Steve will be back to discuss options for obtaining assistive devices and technology. Please see our website for a list of all of our upcoming tech cafes. So thank you again for attending today's presentation, and goodbye for now.
Thanks a lot, everybody.